The book Sangati has been a very interesting read so far. It's really been eye-opening, especially through the use of the author using different narratives to tell the story, and that story being about gender inequality and caste inequality in India. One thing that I noticed very early on is that women are treated very differently in Indian culture and society than they are in the Western world. I knew that this would be the case before we began reading this book because there's always difference in a lot of issues in terms of transcending between different cultures. However, I didn't know that the gap in between the two cultures would be as wide as it is. One thing that I noticed is the much more prevalent attitude of inequality and abuse in India. From watching the news and trying to keep up with different world events, I'd always noticed that there were a lot of reports of sexual assault or abuse of Westerners in India, but never really in terms of the women in India. One reason I think that is because of the gap that the two cultures have and the emphasis that they place on each of these things. But I think that this book really brings a lot of light to that issue, particularly in the story of the young girl who is assaulted outside of her village while she's trying to work, and then falsely accused of having a relationship with another person from the village. And I thought this was interesting because, one, she had not actually had this relationship, but it was believed that she did based on the word of the man who had originally intended to assault her. This really kind of struck a nerve with me and made me almost uncomfortable. In fact, it did make me uncomfortable in regards to the issue because it seemed wrong that someone who was doing something wrong could cover their wrongdoing by blaming the victim of their own crime for another so-called crime in the village. And I thought that it was very interesting that that was highlighted, as I didn't really understand beforehand how that happened. Another thing that I've noticed was a big difference is the way that an accusation like that works in India as opposed to in the Western world. In the Western world, if a woman accuses a man of a sexual assault or an abuse or anything like that, it seems to me that more times, often than not, the woman is viewed, at least before a man could prove that he is innocent, as actually being a victim and having been hurt, which I think is good in a way because it allows women a voice and it allows them an opportunity to take their case before a fair judge as long as they have evidence. But in terms of this story, that didn't really happen, as the girl, even even though she was in the right, she couldn't bring her argument up and be believed because of her position as a lower caste woman. And to me, this story really highlights the difference between gender issues and caste issues and how they overlap in India. One thing that I noticed is that upper caste men seem to believe that lower caste women are less desirable until they attempt to assault one because they view them as weaker. And another thing that I noticed was particularly in terms of the Christian versus Hindu women and their ability to remove themselves from these situations. With the Hindu women, they're able to divorce and remarry, and thus possibly freeing them from a relationship that may be what we would consider in the Western world unhealthy, whether it be abusive or unfulfilling. But Christian women, on the other hand, where divorce is frowned upon or not condoned at all, it's actually much harder for them to change their situation in terms of moving on in a relationship with someone else. And I think that this was another important highlight because in America, in the Western world, we think of if you're unhappy in a relationship or if there's some kind of difference, or you're being abused or in a situation where abuse is common, that there's an out because you can file for a divorce and then that's the end of it in a lot of cases. But for these women, it's much harder. One, because they don't really have the money, but two, also because their religion is so strict that it's really frowned upon. I also noticed a disparity between punishments for certain things in India with women in regards to and men in regards to things, crimes, particularly dealing with relationships. An example of this being the fine of 200 versus 100 between man and woman in terms of the case of the girl who was called out for a relationship that she was not in. Even though she was not in the relationship and she was not in the wrong, she was still punished more severely than the man was. And I think this is interesting because it hits on the fact, once again, of gender inequality and women not being viewed as important or as valued in the society.